She was just a discreet cleaner, marked by a life of silence and repression. During a solitary bath, she fainted without explanation and woke up in the arms of a strange millionaire who knew too much about her. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave your comments saying where you are watching from. The rain beat against the windows of the small kitchenette like desperate fists, and Emily Mitchell adjusted the shawl over her shoulders, observing her pale reflection in the foggy glass. At 23, she carried in her eyes the weight of someone who had never been allowed to truly live. She had grown up amid whispered sermons and silent punishments, under the watchful eye of Mrs. Grace, her adoptive mother, a woman who confused protection with imprisonment and love with control. The phone rang, cutting through the silence of the night, and the rough voice of her boss at the cleaning company echoed through the receiver. "Emily, I need you to go to Cold Springs Mountain right now. New client, big mansion, double payment. You in?" She hesitated for a moment, observing the storm outside. Night jobs always made her uneasy, but the extra money would be welcome. "I'm in," she answered in a low voice, already knowing Mrs. Grace would disapprove. An hour later, she was driving her old Ford Focus up the winding road that climbed the mountain, with the windshield wipers fighting against the torrential rain. The curves were treacherous, and fog was beginning to swallow the landscape around her. When she finally spotted the wrought iron gates of the mansion, she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The property rose among ancient pine trees like an apparition, all in light stone and glass, illuminated by a golden light that contrasted with the darkness of the night. A thin, stern man received her at the gate, identifying himself only as Carl, the caretaker. "You're here for the cleaning. Mr. Blackwood is waiting." Blackwood. The name echoed in her mind strangely, as if she had heard it before in forgotten dreams. She followed Carl through the main entrance, admiring the marble and refined decoration that seemed to have come straight out of a European magazine. Every detail exuded wealth and good taste, but there was something more, a melancholy that seemed impregnated in the walls themselves. "The master had to leave to resolve an urgent matter," Carl explained, as he guided her through the rooms. "He left specific instructions. You can use the service bathroom down the hall to dry off before starting work. He'll return in a few hours." Emily nodded, trying to ignore the strange sensation that she was being watched. The portraits on the walls seemed to follow her with their eyes, and there was a subtle perfume in the air, something between jasmine and aged wood. Carl disappeared into the kitchen, and she found herself alone in the heavy silence of the house. She headed to the bathroom he had indicated, a small but elegant suite completely lined with travertine marble. She was soaked, and her clothes stuck uncomfortably to her body. She decided to take a quick shower before starting work. After all, the owner of the house wasn't present, and she needed to warm up. Under the hot shower jet, she felt her muscles relax for the first time in days. The water ran down her brown hair, washing away the tension she always carried in her shoulders. It was then that she heard, or thought she heard, the distant sound of a piano. A melancholy melody that seemed to come from the walls, as if the house itself was singing a lullaby. She closed her eyes, letting herself be carried away by the music, when suddenly a voice whispered her full name. Emily Mitchell. Her heart raced. No one in that house should know her full last name. She quickly opened her eyes, but the hot water created so much steam that she could barely see. The piano melody continued, clearer now, and with it came images she couldn't explain. Rose petals falling on crystalline water, male hands playing ivory keys, a deep voice calling for someone named Helena. Her vision blurred. She felt her legs give way, the slippery floor beneath her feet. The last thing she remembered was the sound of petals, or were they raindrops, falling softly around her as the world dissolved into golden fragments and darkness enveloped her like an embrace she didn't know she had been waiting for. When she awoke, she was no longer in the marble bathroom. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on the high ceiling decorated with classic moldings. She was lying on an enormous bed, covered with ivory-colored linen sheets, wearing a soft robe that definitely wasn't hers. The room around her breathed masculine. Elegant dark mahogany furniture, an unlit fireplace, shelves full of books that seemed to have been genuinely read. That's when she saw him. Kneeling beside the bed as if in prayer, a man was watching her with an intensity that cut through any possibility of casualness. Nathan Blackwood was younger than she expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with black hair slightly graying at the temples and eyes of such a deep blue that they seemed to contain entire oceans. His face had the melancholy beauty of someone who carried heavy secrets, and when he spoke, his voice sounded low and careful, as if she were made of glass. "How do you feel?" he asked, without rising from his position. There was something reverential in his posture, as if she were a sacred relic that he feared breaking with a sudden movement. Emily tried to sit up, but he extended his hand in a protective gesture. "Slowly, you fainted. Carl found you in the bathroom and called me immediately." What disturbed Emily most wasn't the fact that she had fainted in a strange house, or even being there vulnerable, before a man she didn't know. It was the way he pronounced her name. Emily. As if he had already said it 1,000 times before, with a familiarity that sent shivers down her spine and awakened memories she couldn't identify. There was an old pain in his blue eyes, a guilt that seemed to have deep roots, and when he finally stood up, Emily noticed that his hands trembled slightly. "How do you know my full name?" she asked, pulling the robe closer to her body. The question hung in the air between them like an unformulated accusation. Nathan looked away for the first time, walking to the window where the rain still lashed the glass with renewed fury. His silence lasted too long to be natural. "It's in your company file," he finally replied, but there was something forced in his voice. "Carl showed it to me when you arrived." It was a lie, Emily knew. Her file contained only her first name and a phone number. But something about Nathan, perhaps the way his shoulders curved slightly, or how his hands closed into discreet fists, prevented her from pressing the issue. "I need to leave," she murmured, trying to stand up. Her legs were still weak, and he turned immediately, extending his hand to support her. The touch was electric, brief, necessary, but charged with an intensity that made her instinctively back away. Nathan also retreated, as if he had been burned. "The storm is too strong," he said, his voice more controlled now. "The mountain roads become dangerous with this rain. It would be better to wait until morning." Emily looked out the window and had to agree. The fog was swallowing everything around, and the pines swayed violently under the force of the wind. But the idea of spending the night there, under the enigmatic gaze of that man, made her uneasy in a way she couldn't explain. "I can sleep on the couch in the living room," she offered, but Nathan shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. You had a fainting spell. You can use the guest room downstairs." He paused, studying her face with that disturbing intensity. "But first, you need to eat something. When was the last time you ate properly?" The question caught her off guard. Mrs. Grace had always rigorously controlled her meals, considering gluttony one of the most vile sins. Emily could barely remember when she had last eaten a complete meal. "I don't remember," she admitted quietly, and saw something move in his eyes. Anger, perhaps, but not directed at her. Nathan guided her through the silent house to the kitchen, a spacious and modern area that contrasted with the classic architecture of the rest of the mansion. As he prepared tea and heated some soup, Emily observed him discreetly. There was a natural elegance in his movements, but also a deep sadness that seemed to accompany him like a shadow. When he placed the steaming bowl before her, their fingers touched briefly, and she felt that strange shiver again. "Why did you buy this house?" she asked, trying to break the heavy silence that was forming between them. Nathan served himself some tea, but Emily noticed that his hands continued to tremble almost imperceptibly. "I needed a place to start over," he answered after a long pause. "My wife died 2 years ago. This house seemed like an appropriate place to process the loss." There was something unsaid in his words, a version of the truth that he had rehearsed many times. "I'm sorry," murmured Emily, and she truly was. She had recognized the pain of loss in his eyes from the first moment. "You must have been very happy together." Nathan's face closed like a slamming door. "Happy," he repeated, as if the word were strange in his mouth. "Yes, I suppose we were." He drank his tea in silence, lost in thoughts that clearly tormented him. Emily finished the soup feeling stronger but also more confused. There was something in the atmosphere of that house that affected her in an inexplicable way. It was as if every room held whispered secrets, as if the walls themselves carried memories that she couldn't fully access. And there was that subtle perfume she had noticed upon arrival, jasmine and aged wood, which she now recognized as Nathan's personal scent, a fragrance that awakened strange sensations in her body. "The guest room is right over there," he said, indicating a door at the end of the hallway. "It has everything you need, clean clothes, toiletries." He paused as if struggling against some internal decision. "Emily," he called when she was already heading for the hallway, and she turned to face him. "Tomorrow, when the storm passes, I'd like to make a proposal." "What kind of proposal?" she asked, feeling her heart accelerate for no apparent reason. "I need someone to take care of the house permanently, not just cleaning, someone who would live here, who would keep the place alive." His blue eyes studied her with that disconcerting intensity. "The salary would be very generous. You would have complete freedom to come and go, except—" He stopped as if the next words were difficult to pronounce. "Except what?" "Except to leave permanently. Once you accept, it would be important that you stay." There was something almost desperate in his voice, a need that he tried to disguise with pragmatism. "Think about the proposal. You don't need to decide now." Emily nodded, confused by the implications of what she had just heard. She took refuge in the guest room, a cozy space decorated in shades of blue and white, and tried to process everything that had happened. Why would a rich man like Nathan Blackwood offer such a well-paid job to a simple cleaner? And why the condition of not leaving permanently? More importantly, why, despite all the open questions, was part of her already inclined to accept? Emily woke to the sound of silence. It was a strange sensation, after a lifetime of sharing a small apartment with Mrs. Grace and her whispered morning prayers. The bed was too soft, the sheets smelled of French lavender, and through the window came a golden light that transformed the room into something out of a dream. For a moment, she forgot where she was, until reality returned like a cold wave. The storm, the fainting spell, Nathan Blackwood and his mysterious proposal. She put on the clothes she had left to dry during the night and left the room in search of explanations. The mansion in daylight revealed details that darkness had hidden. Authentic Persian rugs, crystals that refracted rainbows on the walls, and in every corridor, portraits of a blonde woman with green eyes who watched her with a melancholy smile. Helena, she thought instinctively, though no one had mentioned the name of Nathan's deceased wife. She found him in the library, an impressive room with shelves that rose to the high ceiling and a movable wooden ladder. He was sitting in a brown leather armchair reading, and when he raised his eyes from the book, she felt again that strange recognition, as if they had already lived this scene before. Nathan wore a white linen shirt that accentuated the subtle tan of his skin, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes that contrasted with his controlled pose. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, closing the book. She noticed it was a volume of Portuguese poetry. There was something almost intimate in the question, in the way he observed her as if he really cared about her answer. "Yes, thank you." Emily approached cautiously, admiring the thousands of books around. "This library is incredible. Have you read all of them?" A sad smile curved his lips. "Most of them, yes. Books have been my only constant companions in recent years." He stood up, walking to one of the shelves. "Have you thought about my proposal?" The question hung in the air, loaded with expectation. Emily had spent the entire night thinking, struggling between the sensibility that Mrs. Grace had hammered into her head and an inexplicable attraction to this man and this house. "Why me?" she finally asked. "You barely know me. Why would you offer such a generous job to a stranger?" Nathan turned to face her, and for a moment she saw something dangerous gleam in his eyes, an intensity that made her heart race. "Perhaps because you're not as much of a stranger as you think," he murmured, approaching slowly. "Perhaps because this house needs someone like you to start breathing again." "Someone like me?" "Someone pure. Someone who still believes the world can be better than it is. He stopped a few steps from her, so close that she could smell his perfume, that mixture of jasmine and wood that made her dizzy. "Do you accept?" Emily knew she should say no. She knew she should return home to the predictable safety of her previous life, but something about Nathan, perhaps the loneliness she recognized in his eyes, or perhaps the way the entire atmosphere of the house seemed to sigh when he approached, made her nod. "I accept," she whispered, and saw relief and something more dangerous shine in his face. The first days in the mansion were a constant discovery. Nathan showed her every room, explained the routines of the house, introduced her to the few employees who came during the day. Carl, the caretaker, was a man of few words who took care of the garden and maintenance. Celeste, the cook, came 3 times a week to prepare meals and keep the pantry stocked. And there was Louise, an elderly woman who came twice a month to do heavy cleaning that Emily, according to Nathan, would no longer need to worry about. But it was the nights that began to intrigue her. Nathan would disappear into his office for hours, and she would hear the sound of the piano echoing through the corridors, always the same melancholy melodies that made her feel an inexplicable nostalgia. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night, hearing him walk the corridors, like a restless ghost looking for something he had lost. One night, braver than was good for her, she followed the sound of music to the main hall. Nathan was at the piano, his fingers sliding over the keys with a dexterity that spoke of years of practice. His eyes were closed, lost in the music, and there were tears silently running down his face. The song was devastatingly sad, and Emily felt her own tears spring forth without understanding why. That's when he opened his eyes and saw her standing at the entrance. The music stopped abruptly, and for a moment they looked at each other in the heavy silence of the night. "I'm sorry," she murmured, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You never disturb me." He paused, his fingers still resting on the keys. "This music, I used to play it for my wife. Helena loved the piano." The name echoed in the silence, like a confession. Emily approached slowly, hypnotized by the raw pain she saw stamped on his face. Was she very talented? "She was many things," he answered, his eyes lost in memories that she couldn't access. "Beautiful, intelligent, passionate. About life," a long pause, "and very fragile, more fragile than I managed to realize in time." There was something between the lines of his words that made Emily tremble, a guilt so deep that it seemed to be corroding him from within. Without thinking, she extended her hand and touched his shoulder gently. The contact was like an electric spark. He turned to face her with an intensity that made her instinctively back away. "You look like her," he whispered, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "Not physically, but there's something about you that reminds me." He didn't finish the sentence, but rose abruptly from the piano bench. "You should go back to your room, Emily. It's late." But she couldn't move. There was something in the air between them, a tension that grew with each day, each exchanged look, each seemingly innocent conversation. "Nathan," she called softly, and he stopped in the middle of the hall without turning. "What really happened to Helena?" The silence that followed was deafening. When he finally turned, there was a mask of control in place of the vulnerability she had seen moments before. "She died in an accident," he said, his voice too firm to be natural. "There's nothing more to know." But Emily knew there was much more, and as she returned to her room, a strange certainty formed in her mind. Helena wasn't dead, and whatever the truth about what had happened to her, it was intimately connected to the reason why Nathan had brought her to that house. The weeks that followed were a dangerous ballet of approach and retreat. Nathan was always present, but always distant, as if there were an invisible line that neither of them dared to cross. He observed her during the silent dinners with an intensity that made her skin tingle, but never touched her beyond the accidental brushes that seemed to burn them both. There were moments when Emily would catch him looking at her with an expression that mixed adoration and despair, as if she were simultaneously his salvation and his condemnation. The house began to reveal its secrets slowly. Emily discovered locked rooms on the second floor, an attic full of paintings covered by dusty sheets, and a garden in the back where wild roses grew that no one had pruned for years. It was while exploring this garden that she found something that left her breathless. Among the thorns and wild vegetation grew yellow daisies identical to those her adoptive mother used to plant in the tiny yard of the apartment. Flowers that only existed in that specific patch of her childhood and that now spontaneously sprouted on Nathan Blackwood's property. "How did these flowers get here?" she asked Carl when she found him pruning other plants nearby. The man raised his eyes from the bushes and followed her gaze to the daisies. "They've always been there," he muttered. "Since the old owner of the house lived here, Mrs. Hope loved these flowers, said they reminded her of the daughter she had to give away." He stopped abruptly, as if he had said too much, and returned to work with exaggerated intensity. "The old owner? I thought Mr. Blackwood had bought it from a developer." Emily knelt beside the flowers, touching the soft petals. There was something familiar about them, a memory that danced on the periphery of her consciousness. "Mrs. Hope lived here about 20 years ago," murmured Carl, clearly uncomfortable with the subject. "She worked for the family that owned it before. Then she disappeared. No one knows where to." He gave her a strange look. "You look like her. Same height, same way of walking. That's why Mr. Nathan was so interested when he saw you." The world seemed to tilt around Emily. Hope. Mrs. Grace always said that her baptismal name had been Hope, but that she had changed it when she found Jesus. And now she discovered that a woman with that name had lived in the same house where she inexplicably felt at home, taking care of flowers identical to those of her childhood. That night, she confronted Nathan during dinner. He was more silent than usual, moving the food on his plate without really eating, when she decided she could no longer pretend that the coincidences were just coincidences. "You knew my mother," she said, not as a question but as a statement. Nathan slowly raised his eyes, and she saw confirmation in the deep blue of his gaze before he even said anything. "How did you find out?" he asked, setting down his cutlery. His voice was strangely calm, as if he had been expecting this moment for a long time. "The flowers in the garden. Carl told me about Mrs. Hope." Emily leaned forward, her heart beating so hard that she was sure he could hear it. "My mother is called Grace now, but I know her real name is Hope. And I know she worked here." Nathan rose from the table and walked to the window, his hands behind his back. His posture was that of someone carrying a weight that had become unsustainable. "Your mother worked here when I was younger," he finally admitted. "I was married to Helena, but things between us were complicated. Helena had problems, emotional instability that I didn't know how to handle. And my mother? Hope was a relief, a serene presence in a house that lived in turmoil." He turned to face her, and there was a raw vulnerability in his eyes. "We had a relationship, brief, intense, and deeply wrong. I was married. She was an employee. When we discovered she was pregnant..." The world stopped. Emily felt the blood drain from her face as the pieces of an impossible puzzle came together in her mind. "Pregnant with whom?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. "You," he said simply. "You're my daughter, Emily." The silence that followed was total. Emily could hear her own heart beating like drums in her ears, felt the floor moving beneath her feet. 23 years of life. 23 years without knowing who she really was, and now she discovered that she had been brought to her own father's house under the pretext of being an employee. "That's why you brought me here," she managed to articulate, her voice coming out as a strangled whisper. "Not to work. To... what? Replace Helena? Fix your past mistakes?" Nathan took a step in her direction, but she instinctively moved away. "No," he said, his voice laden with pain. "I brought you because I need to redeem myself. I need you to know that I never wanted to abandon you. Helena found out about you and Hope. She made your mother choose, disappear with you or watch our family be publicly destroyed. Hope chose to protect you. And Helena? Helena never recovered from the betrayal. The episodes got worse, more violent. He stopped as if the next words were physically painful. She didn't die, Emily. She's committed to a private clinic. She paid a high price for my infidelity. Emily rose from her chair so abruptly that it fell backward. Everything was wrong. Everything was a lie built upon other lies. The man who had awakened unknown sensations in her body, who made her tremble, with a look, who had begun to occupy her thoughts in a dangerous way, was her father. And for weeks she had been orbiting around him like a moth toward a flame, without knowing she was walking straight into a moral abyss that would destroy her. "I can't stay here," she said, her voice coming out broken. This is sick. You brought me here knowing who I was. You watched me like—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Like a man watches a woman," he completed, and there was a brutal honesty in his admission. "Because that's what you are to me, Emily. I know I should see you as a daughter, but when I look at you, I see the most beautiful woman I've ever known. I see hope. I see Helena. I see someone who could save me from myself." The confession fell between them like a bomb. Emily backed up to the wall, needing the support to avoid collapsing. "You're sick," she whispered. "This thing you feel for me is sick." "I know," he admitted, approaching slowly. "I know it's wrong. I know I'm a monster for desiring my own daughter, but I can't stop. Since I saw you that first night, I can't think of anything else." "Stop," she begged, but he continued approaching, his blue eyes burning with an intensity that terrified and fascinated her at the same time. "You feel it too," he murmured, now so close that she could feel the heat emanating from his body. "I see it in the way you look at me, how you tremble when I'm near." "This desire isn't just mine, Emily." It was true, and this truth destroyed her inside, because even knowing who he was, even understanding the monstrosity of the situation, her body still reacted to his proximity. She still felt that tingling when he touched her, still dreamed of his hands, still desired something that she now knew was absolutely forbidden. Emily fled to her room like a soul in panic, locking the door and leaning against it as if Nathan might pursue her. Her heart was beating so hard it hurt, and her hands trembled uncontrollably as she tried to process the devastating revelation. Daughter. She was the daughter of the man she desired viscerally, the man whose blue eyes made her melt inside, whose jasmine and wood perfume made her dizzy with a need that she now understood to be deeply wrong. She spent the night awake, pacing the room like a caged beast, trying to find a way out of the emotional labyrinth in which she had lost herself. Each memory of the past weeks acquired a sinister meaning. The way Nathan observed her during meals, the almost desperate intensity in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his hands trembled when they approached. He had known from the beginning who she was, and yet had allowed that sexual tension to grow between them like a poisonous plant. But what tormented her most was her own reaction. Even now, even knowing the truth, a disturbed part of her being still responded to the thought of him. She still felt that heat spreading through her lower abdomen when she remembered how he had whispered her name, the way his eyes devoured her when he thought she didn't notice. It was as if her body had developed a chemical dependency that the rational mind couldn't break. In the morning, she made the decision to leave. She packed a small suitcase with the few clothes she had brought and went down to the kitchen, where she knew she would find Nathan having coffee. He was there, standing before the window with a cup in his hands, and when he turned to face her, Emily saw that his blue eyes were red from insomnia and regret. "You're leaving," he said, not as a question but as a painful observation. His voice was hoarse, broken, and there was a resignation in his posture that almost made her waver. "I can't stay," she replied, gripping the handle of her suitcase tightly. This isn't right, Nathan. None of this is right." "I know." He approached slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might run away at any moment. "I know I'm a monster for having allowed things to reach this point. I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning. Then why didn't you tell me?" The question came out laden with a pain she couldn't hide. "Why did you make me go through this?" Nathan stopped a few steps from her, and Emily saw tears glisten in his eyes. Because when I saw you that first night, unconscious in my arms, I thought Helena was coming back to haunt me. You have the same face your mother had at 20, the same pure soul that I destroyed. I thought God was giving me a chance to fix everything. Fix it by falling in love with your own daughter. I didn't fall in love with the daughter, he said, his voice low but firm. I fell in love with the woman, with the way your eyes shine when you're curious, with the delicacy with which you touch things, with the strength you carry without even realizing it. I know it's wrong, I know I have no right, but I can't separate the man I am from the father I should have been. The words hit her like punches to the stomach, because there was brutal honesty in them, a confession that made everything even more complicated. I need to leave, she repeated, but her voice came out less convincing this time. To go where? He asked softly. Back to your mother, to the woman who raised you like a prisoner, who made you believe your own body was a sin. At least here, you began to discover who you really are. It was true, and they both knew it. In the past weeks, Emily had felt more alive than in her entire previous existence. She had discovered that she liked French poetry, that she had a talent for flower arrangements, that her voice was beautiful when she hummed distractedly. She had learned to wear clothes that accentuated her figure instead of hiding it, had tasted expensive wines and discovered the simple pleasure of an intelligent conversation. With Nathan, she had become a version of herself that she didn't even know existed. That doesn't change anything, she said, trying to maintain firmness. It doesn't change the fact that we're father and daughter. Biologically, yes. Nathan took another step, and now he was so close that she could see the small lines around his eyes, the result of years of guilt and solitude. But I was never really your father, Emily. I never raised you, never taught you to take your first steps or speak your first words. To me, you're a beautiful woman who appeared in my life like a miracle. Stop trying to justify something unjustifiable. But even as she said this, she felt her resistance crumbling like sand between her fingers. There was something hypnotic in the way he looked at her, as if she were the only real thing in his world of shadows. I'm not justifying, he murmured, slowly raising his hand to touch her face. The touch was electric, and she found herself involuntarily leaning against his palm. I'm just telling the truth, that this thing I feel for you is stronger than any moral convention, that I'd rather be a monster loving you than an honorable man living without you. The kiss, when it happened, was as inevitable as an avalanche. Nathan leaned in slowly, giving her time to back away. But Emily found herself rising on her tiptoes to meet him halfway. Their lips touched with an almost reverential gentleness, as if they both knew they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. And then something broke inside her. 23 years of repression, of denial, of her own body, of a dormant sexuality exploded all at once. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, and the kiss became desperate, hungry, laden with a need that physically hurt. When they finally separated, both were breathless. Nathan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, as if he were praying or cursing himself. I'm sorry, he whispered. I shouldn't have. Shut up, she murmured, and kissed him again, this time being the one to take the initiative. She didn't want to think, didn't want to analyze, didn't want to remember all the reasons why this was wrong. She wanted only to feel, for the first time in her life, what it was to be desired by someone who looked at her as if she were a miracle. He lifted her in his arms with a strength that surprised her, carrying her to the living room couch as if she weighed less than a feather. His hands explored her body over her clothes with an almost religious reverence, as if each curve were sacred, each sigh she gave were an answered prayer. Are you sure? He asked against her lips, his voice hoarse with contained desire. Because if we continue, there will be no going back. Emily looked into his eyes, seeing in them the reflection of her own madness, and nodded. I'm sure, she lied, because in truth she wasn't sure of anything except the fact that she would die if he stopped touching her at that moment. And then they surrendered to each other with the intensity of people who knew they were committing the ultimate sin, and who had consciously chosen damnation in exchange for a moment of paradise. The days that followed were a dangerous dance between ecstasy and remorse. Emily found herself divided between two versions of herself, the woman who had discovered pleasure in Nathan's arms, who delighted in every touch, every look laden with promise, and the rational person who knew she was living an unsustainable fantasy, built on a rotten foundation of lies and broken taboos. In the morning she would wake in his arms feeling complete for the first time in her life. At night she would cry in the shower, trying to wash from her skin the feeling of being lost in a labyrinth with no exit. Nathan seemed to be living the same internal conflict, but with even greater intensity. There were moments when he treated her like a queen, covering her with affection and attention that made her heart melt. He would bring flowers from the garden to her room, read poetry to her in the library, cook elaborate dishes that they savored in candle-lit dinners. But there were also moments when she would catch him looking at her with an expression of horror, as if he had just awakened from a nightmare only to discover he was living in an even worse one. "What are you thinking about?" she asked one night, finding him standing on the veranda, observing the stars with a drink in his hand. They had just made love with an intensity that left her trembling, but now he seemed lost in dark thoughts. "Helena," he admitted, without taking his eyes off the sky. How she would react if she knew what we're doing. Emily felt a stab of jealousy, a feeling that had become constant since she discovered about the committed wife. "She can't know. You said she's sick. Sick because of me." Nathan turned to face her, and there was such deep guilt in his eyes that Emily wanted to console him. "Helena was always fragile, emotional. When she discovered my betrayal with hope about you, she had her first psychotic break. She said she would kill the child, that she wouldn't allow bastards to corrupt our family. She threatened to kill me. She threatened to kill whoever she found." He took a long drink, as if he needed courage to continue. "Hope fled with you to protect you, but Helena never recovered. The episodes got worse, more frequent. She saw you in every corner of the house, heard baby cries that didn't exist. Until one day, she tried to throw herself from the bedroom window, screaming that she needed to find her husband's daughter to fix the mistake." Emily's blood froze in her veins. "And you committed her." "I had to commit her. It was that or watch her die." Nathan approached, touching her face with a delicacy that contrasted with the brutality of the story he had just told. "But sometimes I wonder if it wasn't cowardice. If I shouldn't have let her follow her self-destructive impulse." "Don't say that." Emily covered his hand with hers, intertwining their fingers. "You did what you thought was right." "I did what was convenient for me," he corrected, his voice laden with bitterness. "I kept Helena away so I could live with my guilt in peace, and now I'm making the same mistake, only worse. I'm involved with my own daughter." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Emily knew he was right. They both knew that what they were living was a distorted version of what should be a healthy relationship. But she couldn't stop. There was something addictive in the way Nathan made her feel desired, powerful, alive. For the first time, she understood what it was to be a woman in all her fullness. "Maybe we should stop," she whispered, but her voice didn't carry conviction. "Maybe," he agreed, but he didn't let go of her hand. "But I won't be able to. You've become my obsession, Emily, my redemption and my downfall at the same time." It was at that moment that they heard the noise, a sound of breaking glass coming from the upper floor, followed by a heavy silence that made them both stiffen. Nathan dropped the glass he was holding, shattering it on the veranda floor. "Stay here," he ordered. But Emily followed him up the stairs, her heart beating so hard it hurt. The noise had come from the master bedroom, the room that had belonged to Nathan and Helena, and that he had kept locked since she arrived at the mansion. The door was open. They entered the room together for the first time, and Emily was hit by a wave of feminine perfume, something floral and heavy that had impregnated the walls over the years. The room was a time capsule, preserved exactly as Helena had left it, cosmetics still scattered on the vanity, clothes hanging in the closet, even an open book on the bedside table as if she had left just for a few minutes. The window was broken. Glass scattered on the floor reflected the moonlight like macabre diamonds, and the curtain billowed with the cold night wind. But what disturbed Emily most was the vanity mirror. Someone had written something on the surface with red lipstick. She, "She is not your daughter," said the message in trembling letters. Nathan turned as pale as death. "Impossible," he murmured, approaching the mirror as if he were seeing a ghost. "No one has access to this house, no one except—" "Except who?" Emily asked, although part of her already knew the answer. "Helena." He turned to face her, his blue eyes dilated with panic. "But it's impossible. She's committed, under heavy medication. There's no way she could leave the clinic." But even as he said this, they both knew that impossible was a word that had lost its meaning since they began living this surreal situation. Emily looked again at the message in the mirror, feeling a strange chill settle in her bones. She is not your daughter. What did that mean? Was Helena delirious, projecting her madness through impossible messages? Or was there something more? A truth that neither of them was prepared to face? "I need to go to the clinic," said Nathan, running his hands through his hair in desperation. "I need to see Helena, make sure she's safe, and that we're safe." "I'll go with you." "No." His response was immediate and firm. "I won't expose you to that. Helena can be dangerous when she has episodes." "More dangerous than the situation we're already in?" Emily laughed without humor. "Nathan, if she was really here, if she managed to get out of the clinic, then neither of us is safe. I need to know the truth as much as you do." He observed her in silence for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant when his resistance crumbled. "All right," he finally agreed. "But if Helena is in crisis, if she shows any sign of violence, you leave immediately. Promise?" Emily nodded, but her attention returned to the mirror and the enigmatic message. Part of her didn't want to discover what those words meant, because if Helena was right, if she really wasn't Nathan's daughter, then what they were living wasn't just morally questionable. It was a lie built upon other lies, a house of cards about to collapse and bury them both in its rubble. But another part of her, the part that had learned to be brave in the arms of this impossible man, knew that there was no choice. They needed to discover the truth, even if that truth destroyed them. Because what they felt for each other, whether right or wrong, healthy or sick, deserved at least complete honesty. The next morning they set out together for Chicago, where the private clinic where Helena was committed was located. During the entire trip, Nathan remained tense, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him connected to sanity. And Emily looked out the window, observing the passing landscape, wondering if she was about to discover who she really was, or if she was walking straight into an abyss that would swallow what remained of her identity. St. Helena Clinic was an imposing building in the lakeside neighborhood, all glass and concrete, with perfectly maintained gardens that tried to disguise its true nature. Emily felt a shiver as she read the name at the entrance, another coincidence in a sequence that had already lost any innocence. Nathan stopped the car in the parking lot and remained motionless for a few minutes, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, breathing irregular. "You don't have to go in if you don't want to," he said, his voice tense. "I can talk to Helena alone and—" "No," interrupted Emily, touching his hand. "We've come this far together. We'll discover the truth together as well." Dr. Martin, the psychiatrist responsible for Helena's case, received them in his office with a concerned expression. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair who emanated professional competence and discretion, but there was something in his eyes that suggested this would not be an ordinary conversation. "Mr. Blackwood," he began after the formal greetings, "I need to inform you that Helena had a serious episode the night before last. She managed to leave her room, despite all the security precautions, and we only found her hours later in the garden, completely soaked by the rain, talking about our daughter she needed to save from the mistake." Nathan and Emily exchanged a meaningful look. The chronology matched perfectly with the events at the mansion. "How did she manage to get out?" asked Nathan, his voice controlled but tense. "We're still investigating. Helena has always been ingenious when she's in crisis, but the most concerning thing isn't how she got out, but what she said when we brought her back." Dr. Martin leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. "She categorically stated that she had been to the mountain, to the old house where you used to live. She described specific details about changes in the decoration that, according to her, only someone who had been there recently could know. The silence that followed was heavy. Emily felt her heart beating so hard that she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "Doctor," she finally said, "we'd like to speak with her." Dr. Martin hesitated. "It's not advisable. Helena is medicated, but still shows signs of agitation when we mention anything related to the past. And Mr. Blackwood's presence could trigger another episode." "Please," insisted Nathan, "I need to see her. I need to understand what's happening." After a long pause, the doctor agreed, but with strict conditions. The conversation would be supervised, limited to 15 minutes, and any sign of agitation would result in the immediate termination of the visit. Helena Blackwood was a woman who had once been beautiful, but who now carried in her eyes and posture the damage of years of heavy medication and mental instability. Her blonde hair was grey at the roots, and she moved with the characteristic slowness of someone living under the effect of sedatives. But when she saw Nathan, something changed in her expression. A dangerous lucidity shone in her eyes. "You brought her," she said, not as a question but as an observation. Her gaze fixed on Emily with an intensity that made the young woman instinctively back away. "The bastard who is sleeping in my bed." "Helena," began Nathan, but she interrupted him with an abrupt gesture. "Don't treat me like I'm crazy, Nathan. I was there. I saw you together on the veranda. I saw how she touches you, how you look at her." Her smile was simultaneously sad and venomous. "But you don't know the truth, do you? You never really knew who she is." "What are you talking about?" Emily found the courage to speak, taking a step forward. "Who am I, besides what we already—" "No?" Helena laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound that echoed through the sterile room. "Hope never told you, did she? She never told you who your real father is." She rose from the chair with abrupt movements, making Dr. Martin tense. "Nathan, do you really believe that saintly woman got pregnant only by you?" The world seemed, to tilt around Emily. "What are you saying?" "Hope worked for us, yes, but she also worked for other rich families in the area, including the Monroes, our neighbors." Helena approached slowly, her eyes fixed on Emily's pale face, particularly for Richard Monroe, who had the same appetite for female employees as my husband. "You're lying," whispered Nathan, but his voice carried more desperation than conviction. "Am I lying?" Helena took from the pocket of her robe an old photo, yellowed by time. "I found this in the attic of the house before I was committed. Hope pregnant, in the Monroe's garden, being embraced by Richard. Look at the date, Nathan. 2 weeks before you discovered she was expecting a child." The photo passed from hand to hand like a silent bomb. Emily observed it with growing horror, recognizing the young face of her adoptive mother, the radiant smile of a woman in love, the protective arms of a man who was definitely not Nathan. The date on the back confirmed what Helena had said. The chronology didn't match what they believed about her conception. "This doesn't prove anything," said Nathan, but his voice sounded hollow. "It could have been just an innocent photo." Helena laughed again. "Oh, my dear naive husband. Hope was in love with Richard Monroe. Everyone knew except you, who were too busy being the jealous and possessive husband to notice that your lover had another lover." Dr. Martin stood up, clearly concerned about the direction of the conversation. "I think it's better we end here." "No," said Emily firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "I need to know. If Richard Monroe is my father, where is he now?" Helena smiled with cruel satisfaction. "He died 5 years ago, cancer. But he left a very rich widow who is very interested in meeting potential heirs." She leaned closer to Emily, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Isabella Monroe has been looking for you for years, dear. Hope hid your existence from her too." The final revelation hit Emily like a tsunami. She wasn't Nathan's daughter. She never had been. All the moral torment they had lived through, all the guilt and self-flagellation, had been based on a lie. The relief she should feel, however, came mixed with an even more disturbing sensation. If she wasn't Nathan's daughter, then what was between them? Was it true love, or just a sick obsession based on a resemblance to Hope? "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice coming out as a strangled whisper. "Because I want him to suffer," replied Helena with brutal honesty, looking at Nathan. "I want him to feel the same thing I felt when I discovered his betrayals. The same confusion, the same pain of not knowing what's real and what's a lie." She turned to Emily. "But also because you deserve to know who you are. And because, contrary to what my husband thinks, I'm not completely crazy, just broken." Dr. Martin ended the visit abruptly, but the damage was already done. During the entire trip back to the mountain, Nathan and Emily remained silent, each lost in their own turbulent thoughts. The truth had freed them from moral guilt, but had created other equally disturbing questions. "If she's right," Emily finally said, when they were already approaching the mansion, "if Richard Monroe is my biological father, then everything we feel for each other is real," completed Nathan, but there was a deep sadness in his voice. "It has nothing to do with you being my daughter or looking like Hope. It's just us." But even as he said this, they both knew that the discovery had changed everything between them. Because if the relationship was no longer morally questionable, it had also lost its forbidden intensity, its desperate urgency. And they both wondered, without the courage to verbalize it, whether what they felt would survive the absence of the transgression that had given rise to it. The days following the visit to the clinic were marked by a strange melancholy that hung over the mansion like morning fog. Emily and Nathan circled around each other with excessive care, as if they were two strangers, trying to discover how to relate without the weight of the transgression that had fueled their passion. The truth had freed them from moral guilt, but had also removed the desperate intensity that made each touch, each look, a visceral necessity. "You're different," said Nathan one morning, finding her in the garden where she was tending to the rose bushes. There was a new distance in his voice, a formality that hadn't existed before. Distant. Emily didn't raise her eyes from the flowers. "I'm processing," she replied, but they both knew it was more than that. It was as if, in the absence of the forbidden, they had lost the common language that connected them. "Nathan, I need to ask you something." "Anything." "Did you love me because you thought I was your daughter, or in spite of thinking I was your daughter?" The question came out, laden with a vulnerability she couldn't hide. "Because now that we know the truth, I don't know what we are to each other anymore." Nathan knelt beside her among the rose bushes but didn't touch her. "I fell in love with you," he said slowly, as if he were discovering the words as he spoke. "With the brave woman who emerged from the repressed girl, with the way your eyes shine when you're curious, with the delicacy with which you treat everything around you. The fact that I thought you were my daughter made it more intense, more urgent, but it wasn't what created the feeling." "Are you sure?" She finally faced him, and he saw tears in her brown eyes. "Because I don't know who I am anymore, Nathan. For 23 years I believed I was one thing. In the last few weeks I discovered I was another. And now I discover I might be a third, completely different thing." It was then that Nathan touched her, taking her dirt-covered hands in his. "Then let's discover together," he said with a determination she hadn't heard in days. "Let's find Isabella Monroe. Let's discover everything about your biological father, about your true history, and then we'll decide who we want to be from me here on." The decision to seek out Isabella Monroe brought a new dynamic to their relationship. It was a common project, a search for truth that united them again in purpose. They discovered that she lived in an even more imposing mansion than Nathan's, in the Riverside neighborhood of Chicago, and that she had become one of the country's greatest art collectors after her husband's death. When they called to schedule a meeting, the response came more quickly than they expected. Isabella Monroe not only agreed to receive them, but seemed strangely prepared for the conversation. "I've been waiting for this call for a long time," said her elegant voice over the phone. "Can you come tomorrow?" The Monroe Mansion was a work of art in itself. Modern American architecture surrounded by sculpted gardens and a contemporary art collection that left Emily breathless. Isabella was a 60-year-old woman who had aged with elegance, perfectly, arranged silver hair, and an intelligent look that seemed to read people like open books. "You have his eyes," was the first thing she said when she saw Emily, even before the introductions. "And the same way of tilting your head when you're nervous." Richard did exactly that. They spent the next 2 hours in a conversation that was simultaneously revealing and devastating. Isabella told them about her husband, a charismatic but troubled man who had had several extramarital affairs over the years. Hope had been one of them, but different from the others for a specific reason. "Richard truly fell in love with your mother," explained Isabella, serving tea in fine porcelain. "It was the only time I was really concerned about the possibility of losing him. Hope was a special, pure, genuine, different from the other women who normally attracted him. And you knew about me?" asked Emily, still processing the idea of having a father who had died without knowing her. "I suspected." When Hope disappeared pregnant, Richard was devastated. He hired detectives to look for her, but she had completely vanished. "We never managed to find her." Isabella paused, studying Emily's face. "After Richard died, I continued searching, not out of jealousy, but because he deserved to know his daughter, and you deserve to know your true heritage." "Heritage?" "Richard left specific instructions in his will. If a biological daughter was ever found, she would be entitled to a considerable portion of the fortune." Isabella smiled for the first time since they arrived. "You're very rich, my dear. Rich enough to never depend on anyone again." The revelation hit Emily like lightning. Not only had she discovered her true identity, but she had also gained complete financial independence. It was simultaneously liberating and terrifying, because it meant that any choice she made from then on would be genuinely hers. During the trip back, the silence in the car was laden with unexpressed possibilities. "So," said Nathan finally, "you're Emily Monroe now. Heiress to a fortune, free to do anything you want. And you," she asked, "what will you do now that you don't need to feel guilty about keeping me in your house anymore?" "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time in years, I really don't." "No." They arrived at the mansion at dusk, and Emily went straight to her room, which she now knew she had chosen to remain in by her own will, not out of necessity or manipulation. She looked at herself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman she saw reflected. She was no longer the repressed girl who had arrived there months ago, nor the forbidden lover who had discovered herself in recent weeks. She was someone completely new, someone with power, choices, and responsibility for her own destiny. When she went down for dinner, she found Nathan preparing an elaborate meal, as he always did when he was nervous. "Emily," he said without turning from the stove, "I need you to know that I don't expect anything from you. You're free to leave, to start a new life, to—" "And if I don't want to leave?" she interrupted, surprising them both with the firmness in her voice. "What if I want to stay and discover what we are when there are no secrets, no guilt, no obligations between us?" Nathan turned slowly, and for the first time in days, she saw genuine hope in his blue eyes. "You would stay?" "For now," she answered, approaching. "To see if what we feel survives complete honesty, to discover if you can love me as Emily Monroe, not as the lost daughter or the replacement for Hope." "And Helena?" he asked. "What do we do about Helena?" Emily thought of the broken woman she had met at the clinic, destroyed by years of lies and betrayals. "We help her truly heal," she finally said, "because everyone in this story was a victim of others' lies, including you." When they kissed that night, it was different from all the other times. There was no desperate urgency, no guilt corroding the edges of pleasure. There were just the two of them, discovering each other again, building something new on the ruins of what had been before. And for the first time, Emily felt that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. The months that followed were of careful reconstruction. Emily used part of her inheritance to renovate the mansion, not to erase Helena's memories, but to create spaces that were truly hers and Nathan's. She transformed the master bedroom into a suite that carried no ghosts from the past, created a studio where she discovered she had a talent for painting, and redesigned the garden so that the flowers from her childhood could coexist harmoniously with new species she chose to plant. Nathan, for his part, began therapy, something he had resisted for years, but that Emily made a non-negotiable condition for their relationship. "If we're going to build something real," she said one morning, holding his hands across the breakfast table, "you need to truly face your demons. Not for me, for you." Therapy brought painful but necessary revelations. Nathan discovered that his pattern of destructive relationships came from a childhood marked by an emotionally absent mother and an authoritarian father who saw affection as weakness. Helena had been his first attempt to save someone, and when that failed, he transferred the same compulsion to Hope, and then to Emily. "I don't love to be loved," he confessed one night, after a particularly difficult session. "I love to feel necessary. And that's not real love, it's selfishness in disguise." Emily listened to him in silence, recognizing in herself some of the patterns he described. "Then we need to learn together," she finally said. "Learn to love without needing to save, to be loved without needing to be perfect." The big test came when they decided to visit Helena again. This time she was more stable, her medications adjusted, participating in occupational therapy. When she saw them together, her smile was genuine for the first time in years. "You look at peace," she observed, studying their faces. "Different from when you came the last time." "We're learning to be different," replied Emily, "and we wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" Helena seemed genuinely surprised. "For telling us the truth, for forcing us to face the lies we were living." Emily leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Helena, Nathan told me about your plans to move to a smaller, more humanized clinic. I'd like you to consider another option." What she proposed surprised even Nathan. Emily had used part of her inheritance to buy a spacious house on the West Coast, equipped with specialized nurses and therapists. A place where Helena could have supervised autonomy, dignity, and the chance to rebuild her life away from the ghosts that haunted her at Cold Springs Mountain. "Why would you do this for me?" asked Helena, tears glistening in her eyes. "After everything I did." "Because you freed us," Emily replied simply, "and because everyone deserves a second chance." Helena's move to the coastal house marked a new chapter for everyone. Nathan visited her once a month, difficult but necessary conversations that gradually healed old wounds. Helena began painting again, something she had abandoned years before, and her canvases showed an emotional evolution that impressed the therapists. "She's becoming who she was before the marriage," commented Dr. Martin during one of the follow-up visits. "Stronger, more centered. The change of environment was fundamental." Meanwhile, Emily and Nathan built their relationship on completely new foundations. Without secrets, without guilt, just the daily choice to love each other despite their imperfections. There were difficult moments, discussions about the future, insecurities that emerged from years of toxic relationships, the need to establish healthy boundaries. "Sometimes I'm afraid you'll leave," Nathan admitted on a winter night as they watched the rain through the library window. "Not because you're obligated to stay, but exactly the opposite, because now you can choose, and you can choose to leave all this behind." "And sometimes I'm afraid that you love me only because I remind you of other people," replied Emily, resting her head on his shoulder. "Hope, Helena, some idealized version of who I could be." "So we're two haunted people trying to build something real," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Maybe that's exactly what we need. Two broken people fixing each other." The marriage. Proposal came unexpectedly, on an ordinary afternoon when Emily was painting in the garden and Nathan was reading on the nearby veranda. There were no grand gestures or dramatic declarations. He simply stood up, walked over to her, and knelt among the paints and canvases. "Marry me," he said without a ring, without a rehearsed speech. "Not because we need each other, but because we choose each other every day." "Yes," she answered, without hesitation, her hands still dirty with paint when she kissed him, but with one condition. Any condition. "I want Hope to marry us. I want my mother, my real mother, to give us her blessing." Finding Hope was easier than they imagined. She was living in a small apartment in Portland, working as a seamstress, living a simple but dignified life. When she opened the door and saw Emily, her legs faltered. "My girl," she whispered, her hands trembling as she touched her daughter's face. "My beautiful girl, I knew one day you would find me." The conversation that followed was one of healing and forgiveness. Hope told her version of the story, the complicated loves, the impossible choices, the decision to protect Emily by keeping her away from a world of privileges corrupted by lies. There were tears, there was anger, there was forgiveness. "You were the mother I needed to have," said Emily, embracing Hope. "Grace protected me from the world, but you gave me life. Both were necessary." "And now?" asked Hope, looking at Nathan, with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. "Now we're a strange but true family," replied Nathan, "and we would like you to bless our marriage." The wedding took place in the mansion's garden on a spring afternoon, surrounded only by the people who truly mattered. Helena, surprisingly stable and radiant, was the matron of honor. Hope officiated the ceremony with a moving simplicity. Carl and Celeste, who had become family over the months, were the only other witnesses. "You choose to love each other despite the errors of the past," said Hope, holding their hands. "You choose to build something new on the ruins of what was. It's the bravest thing two people can do." When they kissed as husband and wife, there were no ghosts watching, no guilt at the edges of happiness. There were just the two of them, imperfect and human, promising to discover together who they could become when love is a choice, not an obsession. 3 years later, Emily Blackwood walked through the halls of Chicago's most prestigious art gallery, observing the works she had created in recent months. Invented Memories was the name of the exhibition. Canvases born from the fragments of a reconstructed life, colors that emerged from the ashes of burned secrets, shapes that danced between what was real and what could have been. The main canvas occupied an entire wall, a mansion among pine trees, rose petals falling like golden rain, and two figures touching each other not with desperation, but with choice. It was the most autobiographical work she had ever created, but also the most universal. It spoke of people who choose to love each other despite everything that conspires against them. "Are you nervous?" asked Nathan, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. 3 years of marriage had softened his features in subtle ways. Less tension around the eyes, more ease in his smile, a peace he had never imagined possible. "A little," she admitted, accepting the glass. "It's strange to expose our story this way, even if it's only our version of it. Our version is the only one that matters now." The opening of the exhibition was a success beyond expectations. Critics praised the emotional maturity of the works, the way she managed to transform personal trauma into universal art. But the most important moment for Emily came when she saw Helena standing before one of her paintings, tears silently running down her face. "This is me," said Helena when Emily approached. The canvas showed a blonde woman emerging from the waters of a lake, not like Venus being born beautiful and perfect, but like someone who had chosen to survive drowning. "It's how I feel now. Reborn." "How are you?" asked Emily, gently touching. The arm of the woman who had once been her greatest threat and was now something like an unlikely friend. "Well, surprisingly well." Helena smiled, and it was a genuine smile, without the layers of fears and resentments that had distorted it for years. "I met someone in therapy, a widower who is also rebuilding his life. Nothing serious yet, but it's good to remember that I can still feel things besides pain. I'm happy for you, and I for you too." Helena looked around the gallery, where Nathan was animatedly talking with journalists about his wife's works. "He seems light. I never saw him like that when we were married." "People can change," said Emily, "when they choose to change." "Yes, they can." Helena paused as if gathering courage for something. "Emily, I need to apologize for everything, for the way you discovered the truth, for the threats, for the—" "It's already forgiven," interrupted Emily gently. "You gave us the truth when we needed it, in a brutal way perhaps, but necessary." The conversation was interrupted by Hope, who arrived accompanied by a pleasant man in his 60s. "My daughter," she said, embracing Emily. "I want you to meet John, my boyfriend." It was surreal and wonderful at the same time. All the women who had shaped Nathan's life gathered in an art gallery, all rebuilding their lives in different but authentic ways. Hope had found a late but true love. Helena was learning to live without the constant shadow of betrayal. And Emily had discovered who she was when she wasn't running from anything or trying to save anyone. A toast, said Nathan when everyone gathered at the end of the night, to the extraordinary women who made it possible for me to become a better man. A toast, corrected Emily, to the people who choose to grow instead of just survive. Later, back at the mansion on the mountain, Emily and Nathan walked through the garden under the light of the full moon. The rose bushes she had planted were in full bloom, harmoniously mixing with the daisies from her childhood and the wildflowers they had allowed to grow freely. "There's one thing I never told you," murmured Nathan, stopping beside the fountain they had installed in the center of the garden. "About that first night when you fainted." "What?" "When I held you in my arms unconscious, I had the strangest sensation. It wasn't desire or guilt or confusion about who you were." He turned to face her, his blue eyes shining under the moonlight. "It was the sensation that I was holding my future, as if my entire past had been just the necessary journey to arrive at that moment." "And now?" she asked, touching his face. "Do you still feel that?" "Now I know that the future isn't something you hold," he answered, kissing her palm. "It's something you build day after day, choice after choice." "Very philosophical for a man who 3 years ago thought love was synonymous with possession," she teased, laughing. "I learned from the best teacher," he said, pulling her into his arms. "An artist who paints memories that never existed, but that are more true than reality." When they kissed in the perfumed garden, under the stars that had witnessed so many dramas and revelations, there was no desperate urgency or guilt corroding the edges of pleasure. There was only the deep satisfaction of two people who had chosen to love each other through all the storms, who had transformed obsession into companionship, secrets into transparency, necessity into choice. In the apartment in Portland, Hope embraced John on the small living room sofa, watching the news about her daughter's exhibition on television. "She did it," she whispered, tears of pride glistening in her eyes. "She managed to be happy despite everything." In the house on the coast, Helena painted a new canvas, this time a self-portrait where she smiled genuinely, surrounded not by shadows of the past, but by future possibilities. And in the mansion on Cold Springs Mountain, Emily and Nathan slowly climbed the stairs to the bedroom they had created together, where no ghost awaited them, where each night was a renewed choice to love each other not despite their imperfections, but through them. "You know what impresses me most about our story?" said Emily, standing at the bedroom window observing the garden where everything had begun. "What?" "That it didn't end with a happy ending," she replied, turning to face him. "It ended with a true beginning." Nathan smiled, extending his hand to her. "Then let's begin," he said simply. And that's what they did. They began, once more, choosing each other in the golden light of the room they had built together, finally free of the ghosts that had for so long haunted both the living and the almost dead. They began as two people who had learned that true love isn't what survives despite obstacles, but what strengthens by choosing to grow through them. On the foggy mountain, the mansion sighed as if releasing a breath it had held for decades, and within its walls echoed no longer the sound of whispered secrets or tears shed in solitude, but the rarest